It's been a few weeks, so let's take a look at all of the interesting source files that I've built. Wow, that's a lot. So maybe by now, some of you on the first time you signed into JupyterHub were thinking about this, but you look at all these files and you think this is a mess. What you want to do is organize the files into folders. And you might have tried doing that, and I mentioned at the beginning that if you tried organizing things into folders early, you'd notice that things tend to fall apart. So maybe it's time we sorted that out. We've gotten enough experience writing code now that the extra stuff we have to do to use folders won't make us panic just as much. So let's go over first what the problem with using folders is that you might notice. So here I have this tracing example from last week. I can compile it. I can run it. Okay, so that works. But then if I go into my file browser and I make a new folder, and so I could just right-click here and hit New Folder, and I'll call it squares. So it'll be for all of my code involving squares. And I take my squares tracing.c. Maybe I'll close this in my editor. It doesn't like it if I move files when they're still open. I move it over to my folder squares. Then I go into it, and we can see there I am in the folder, and there's my code squares tracing.c, and here's my terminal. And great, so I now have a folder. It's got the code I want in it. I can now organize all of my code. But then I try compiling, and it breaks. It says no such file. But we just tried it. I mean, we see the file. We have it open in our editor. So what actually happened here? The issue is that all of the different pieces of your lab environment, so the thing over on the left, the file browser, the text editor, and the terminal are sort of independent. When you went into a folder in your file browser, the terminal didn't catch up. As far as the terminal knows, you are still outside in your root folder, out with all the other files. So what we have to talk about if we want to use folders is how do we tell the terminal to go into a folder, not just the file browser? And the answer is actually relatively simple. So here I am in my root folder, and if you're ever in the terminal and you want to know what files you have around, you can type this, ls. And all it does is list all the files in the current directory. And here you can see all the same files that I have in my file browser on the left. Okay, so that means the terminal is in the same directory that I'm in over here. And here I am going into my squares directory. If I go to my terminal and I type ls, I still have all the same stuff. So the terminal hasn't caught up. It's not in the same directory as what I have over here. And to change directory, you can use the following command. So the directory I'm in is called squares. And to change into that, we type cd space and then the name of the directory, squares. And then you might notice the prompt you get changes a little bit. Previously, it said this. For the whole semester so far, we've been looking at this prompt. Now we notice it says squares at the end to show that you're inside a folder. If I type ls, hey, there's my squares tracing.c. Okay, so now let's try compiling again. And this time, it works. So that actually is all you have to do if you want the terminal to go into a directory. The reason we didn't get into that on day one is that I figured we've already got enough to worry about on day one if it weren't for the folders, and maybe we should lay off. And also because once you get into a folder in your terminal, there's also the question of, hey, how do I get back out again? So you have a couple of options. You might notice this latter part of the prompt shows you what folder you're currently in. If all it shows you is this tilde character, that means that you're in your root directory. Suppose I want to go back up to my root directory here. So I go back to my root directory. In the terminal, you can type cd and then a space and then ... so 2 periods. And that takes you back to your root directory. We can type ls. There's all the files. Another way of doing it is if you're in any directory at all, so here I am back in my squares directory, you could just type cd. And if you type cd and don't give it any arguments and press enter, you go back to your root directory. So if you want to use folders, you go ahead. You're not tested in this course on whether you know how to use folders, or in general, you're not tested on the way you set up the environment. The course is only really testing you on, can you write code, can you read code? But if you choose to use folders, you will probably find it keeps things way more organized, because by the end of the semester, there will be hundreds of files that you have to keep track of. And so folders are great for keeping, let's say, your assignment submissions separate from lab submissions, separate from examples that you go through in the lectures, also separate from maybe code that you download from Connex. So you can give that a try. There are a few other terminal commands that you might learn over time, and it is one of those things that can come in handy later in future programming courses. And if you go on to use any kind of machine, whether it's a virtual environment like this, or a Mac machine or a Windows machine, they all have their own variants of a terminal, and they all use commands like cd to move around between folders.